And so their freely willed actions then lead them to this realization or this discovery or whatever that has refluxed in their brain and caused them to do this. So there's this time loop in time, this loop in time, this causal loop in time. And it acts like a force. And I think of this a lot in like gravity, because, we think of there being four forces in nature. The electromagnetic force, then there's a couple of nuclear forces, and then there's gravity. But if you talk to a physicist, they'll say, gravity isn't really a force. It's not a force in the same sense that electromagnetism is a force. It's simply the curvature. It's simply the curvature of space into time. It's sort of the shape of space-time that kind of leads things to follow certain paths. And that's kind of the way I think of the space-time of our lives, or our fate, if you will.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernard Beitman, MD. I'm a psychiatrist, and I get to talk about crazy stuff because I can try to differentiate between the two. And today we're going to be talking about precognition, the ability to see some things into the future. The other day, I was going over to visit a friend of mine, and earlier in that day, I had this image in my intuitive movie screen of my mind that a saxophone was going to be in my life sometime soon. Well, you could guess he's a musician, but we listened to John Coltrane, who plays a great saxophone, for quite a while, and we never had done that before. So it was a bit of a prediction. And as I think you'll hear from our guest today, Eric Wargo, that we all receive oblique and foggy signals from our future self when we are creating or just hanging around thinking and letting stuff come in, just as folklore insists we do when we sleep. So I welcome Eric to the show, and I will tell you a little bit about him. Uh, he has a PhD in anthropology from Emory University and is the author of From Nowhere. From Nowhere. It's his current book, and you can see a link to it underneath his bio, as well as two previous books on precognition, one Precognitive Dreamwork and The Long Self, and the very acclaimed Time Loops. He also writes about science fiction, consciousness, parapsychology at his blog called The Nightshirt. Eric, welcome to Connecting with Coincidence.
Thank you for
Again.
having me on again.
It's great. It's great to see you.
Very coincidental
Well,
somehow.
that's one of the things that I like to be able to say is that when you can define why it or how it happened, it's no longer a coincidence, because a coincidence means you don't know how it happened. There could be an explanation, but you don't know what it is. And one of the major emphasis that I see you having done is trying to link synchronicity and precognition. That a lot of synchronicities you think of as precognitive. Uh, could you tell us about that link as you see it?
Yeah, well, that's interesting the way you defined coincidence, because you're right. We sort of, a coincidence is when we just don't have an explanation for it, and that can often be very exciting and thrilling or mysterious or scary, depending on your attitude. I think I think of it in a different idiom, I guess, than this idiom of precognition, because I think there is an explanation for a lot of these experiences, not all of them, but um, uh, you mentioned synchronicity. Back when Carl Jung was the great kind of pioneer and prophet, of meaningful coincidence and trying to really theorize these events, and he had his whole framework based on depth psychology and his sort of mystical take on psychoanalysis. But he was writing, so that was a very important moving I guess, the ball forward of thinking about coincidence and meaningful coincidence. Um, but he was writing in the middle of the 20th century at a time when the idea of, although precognition had been named and it had been studied a little bit, for instance, in the Rhines lab at Duke University, nevertheless, there wasn't any kind of physical framework that could make sense of it. And he was dubious for that reason. There's a passage right in his book, Synchronicity, that, the idea of some event in the future, causing an event in the past is just nonsensical because it means somehow energy flowing backward in time. And so he rejected a view of what we now call retrocausation as just being sort of beyond the pale. Well, physics has moved on from that, and more physicists are talking about retrocausation. It's a kind of an idea that has always been anathema to physicists since the Enlightenment. It's been sort of dogma that causes go a single direction in time. But quantum physicists know that at the smallest scales, that linear causation breaks down, and that causes can go in reverse. And it's now being demonstrated in laboratory experiments, even, and in quantum computing circuits, that you can scramble the order of cause and effect. And at the same time, you've got quantum biology and quantum neuroscience, which are sort of coming into their own, and they're showing how these spooky effects in the micro world can scale up in living systems. And I think we're on the verge of potentially understanding how indeed information from an organism's future can get into their past and influence them. And that's very exciting to me, because I think it totally reframes this question of coincidence and this question of these experiences that are just part of the human experience, throughout history and throughout time and across cultures, uh, and that have invited various, usually spiritual explanations or whatever, or Jungian kind of sort of halfway psychological, halfway spiritual explanations. I think that indeed it's going to be shown uh, sooner or later that indeed the human brain just gets information from its future all the time, and that this is a guidance system, and it's the source of our most brilliant ideas in the arts and in sciences. Um, and it just sort of guides us in everyday life. And we have these experiences like you just described, like something comes into your head, some random thought comes into your head, and then, you know, 30 minutes later, that thing is there in your life physically in one way or another. And when you pay attention to these kinds of things, when you pay attention to your own thoughts, you notice this happening all the time. And I think it's going to be shown that it's basic to our psychology. Uh,
Let me make a visual of what I think you're describing, a visual that I have recently developed personally. Uh, we call this term intuition,
mhm,
but it has all kinds of variables that we cover with intuition. And one of them is this precognitive capacity that I described with the saxophone.
mhm,
And how I experience this is related to how each of us can create movies in our minds about the past. We can remember things that happen in a visual sense. We can imagine the future, uh, imagine things that are going to happen, what I'll say when I go someplace. So these are visual movies that we create from our visual memory. But there is also this another movie screen, an intuitive movie screen,
mhm,
where the information isn't from five senses. It's from someplace else, and it's from time being more variable and space being more variable, time and space being more flexible, as you were being able to talk about. So I saw this saxophone on this kind of shadowy movie screen of my intuition. And I'm able to do that more and more to allow myself to look at that movie screen. And so I'm at intuition precognitive movie screen. I'm wondering how how you do this and how you suggest people might be more tuned in to information from the future.
Yeah. Well, yeah, a movie screen is, a nice metaphor for the imagination, and I talk a lot in the new book about the imagination and how it sort of mediates information both coming from the future and from the past. People have this idea that when we remember something, we're somehow just replaying a video of an event that happened in the past. But in fact, we know psychologists know that's not how memory works. A memory is an imaginative construct. It's constructed from schemas and from bits and pieces, and it's a new thing. It's like a little TV show that we put on to stand in for some experience that we sort of think we had, and that typically is not accurate, in all kinds of ways. And the same is true of precognition. I mean, precognition is memory for the future, but it's mediated by the imagination in the same way, and we construct it from bits and pieces uh, of our experience, and the things we know, things we don't know in the future that happen, that reflux and influence us in the present. We're not seeing them directly like in a video camera. We're the imaginative component in our heads is creating a little diorama, with bits and pieces that taken from our experience, and creating this kind of tableau or diorama or whatever. But the metaphor that I like, to go back to you talk about movie screen, I think of it more as a augmented reality app. If you've ever used an augmented reality app on your smartphone, you're using the phone's camera to sort of see the world, but it's overlaying information um, onto that camera's eye view of the world. So it's adding new information that's potentially useful or whatever to that scene. And I think that's very often how precognition manifests in waking life for people who are highly uh, imaginative, highly sort of attuned to their intuition and so on. They go through life, but there's certain things are accentuated. There's these, sometimes they'll literally have visions, or, what psychiatrists call hallucinations, uh, that are, really representing or pre-presenting something that's about to happen, or that's going to happen in the future. So it's like an overlay onto your sensory experience. So yeah, I like to think of it as augmented reality. I think that's going to be a good
Okay,
metaphor
and you're
for what.
doing overlay on our current reality, and
Right.
your new book from nowhere does a lot with artists being able to predict the future. Uh, of course, the sinking of the Titanic is fairly well known in the coincidence literature, that the book was written and then the Titanic sank, and there was a lot of correlations. But you also talk about an avant-garde painter depicting a life-changing injury on one of his canvases.
Mhm.
This is very visual.
Right.
Uh, this this is uh, this is for maybe you augmented reality. For me, it's reading off the screen of his future, and it's still they're both visual. And how and I am so let's say, humbled by recognizing that my experience isn't your experience and the way we experience things isn't the same, and trying to be able to see how different people do it different ways. Unfortunately, so many smart people who know what's right say it's my way is the right way because I did it my way, and we're so limited and don't realize that. So we have two metaphors, the TV screen, one that I experience, and the overlaid virtual reality one that you're describing, and other people may have other ways of experiencing the way the future comes in. This artist, why don't you tell us about that story?
Yeah, you're talking about Victor Brauner. He was a surrealist painter in I think it was the teens or 20s. I'm forgetting his dates exactly, in Paris. And he, for I think close to a decade or maybe like 8 years, he was obsessed with figures, including himself, missing an eye, okay, or with an eye that was blinded. Okay, he painted a self-portrait called Self-Portrait with enucleated eye, and I forget the date of the portrait. And then he painted several portraits of famous people and friends and so on, all of which were missing an eye. And he painted a portrait of Hitler with a dagger in the eye and so on. Maybe this was the 30s actually. And so then randomly, he got in the midst of a bar fight between two surrealist friends of his, two Spanish surrealists. I'm forgetting their names, but they got typical surrealist kind of episode where they got into a bar fight over some who knows what, whether it was a woman or their views on aesthetics or whatever. Anyway, one of them hurled a glass. Victor Browner tried to intercede in the fight, but he wound up getting hit by the glass and it hit him in the eye and put his eye out. Um, so, incredibly, how can you chalk that up to coincidence in the sort of sense in which a skeptic or debunker would use that term? I mean, that is so specific, you know, to his later experience, and it's an important experience in his life. He's a painter. He uses his eyes, and just lost one of them, you know. That was a huge, huge turning point in his life. And that was, that's just an incredible coincidence. The thing is that kind of thing happens again and again and again in the lives and biographies of artists and writers. I mean, these are not little occasional one-offs. The more you delve into the biographies of artists, you find that they're very often uh, foretelling uh, events, not necessarily like world events like the Titanic, things like that, but they're foretelling future salient experiences in their own lives. And it's incredibly common. So my book is full of examples of this. And actually, there's going to be a follow-up book with even more examples because it's such a prevalent thing in the lives of creative people. I'll give you another example that I think is even more striking of
Just a moment, because as I'm tracking what you're saying, I'm trying to maybe get in the mind of our listeners and viewers is how they can think about these things for their own lives.
Mhm.
And that's all I'm pausing to do, that he he somehow could, the artist picked up what was going to happen to him without knowing it. And then he recorded it so that you can talk about it, really. That you're part of this loop also, because you're emphasizing him in some way, part of the whole thing. So I'm not going to ask you to answer it. We talked about it kind of before, but I'm asking us to keep in mind, how do we admit into our consciousness what you so passionately know is true?
Right. Well, I always tell people, just if you're already interested in this stuff, it means you're probably doing the right thing, which is you are paying attention. You're paying attention to your experience. You are recording your thoughts and ideas in one way or another. Maybe, my previous book was about dream work and keeping a dream diary. If you are attuned to the dream world, you are that's step one in getting attuned to precognition in while you sleep.
Oh, oh,
But
tune to the dream world. That will get you the dream world in waking life, because it's a
right.
dream anyway, what we're doing when we're alive. Okay.
But
Okay.
artists are, attuned in another way. In their waking life, they're attuned, and they know that those subtle feelings that we call intuition or whatever uh, matter, and that's what fuels their creativity. Some little idea that most of us will just kind of ignore, they'll like get interested in and work it out in whatever medium that they work in. So for Victor Browner, it was painting. Um, but whatever medium, whether it's writing or sculpture or whatever, they will work out those ideas. One of the, a great illustration of this, I honestly, I think the best film about the creative life is Close Encounters. Okay, and I talk about this in the book a bit. People think of it as a story about a UFO encounter, but really it's a story about creativity, because what happens is, um, Richard Dreyfuss in the film plays this character named Roy Neary, who sees a UFO, and suddenly he's obsessed with this image, that he can't get clear, but it's an image of some sort of tower, some sort of natural kind of tower. And he starts kind of doing these kind of sketches and rough drafts in, shaving cream and then mashed potatoes. He's like piles up the mashed potatoes on his plate, and he like starts scoring it with a fork. What is this? And then he gets more and more obsessed, and his family doesn't know what the hell has gone wrong with their dad, and his wife leaves him and all that. It's like typical story of a man going through a midlife crisis and suddenly becoming an artist. Anyway, and then he's like dragging dirt and stuff into the living room to create this big sculpture of this thing that's this obsessing him, you know, and it's this tall kind of mountain and that's scored with lines along the sides, and and then he looks over at the TV, and there's a news story about this fake chemical spill at Devil's Tower in Wyoming, and it just matches, like, oh my God, that's it. Well, people watch this film and think, and I imagine this is what Steven Spielberg sort of intended you to think, was that the UFOs somehow implanted telepathically some, image of Devil's Tower in his head in order to lure him there. But another way of looking at this is precognition, that the UFO encounter just sort of awakened his natural, intuitive, precognitive sense. And he's suddenly working it out in art and having this experience that so many artists have of creating a work of art and then seeing it seeing it in real life. It's that's the precognitive imagination at work. And so yeah, I mean, how do you activate or access this in real life? Be creative, do the creative stuff, take up an art form, uh, engage that artistic, intuitive, non-rational side of yourself, because it's those aspects of our personality that are, open to this influence in our lives. And I think it's the fact that our society is so dominated by that other personality that is very rigid, as you say, and systematic, and rejecting of the unconscious and rejecting of intuition. Those kinds of people, those sort of business-like kinds of minds, are always going to kind of reject this possibility of foreseeing the future, or intuition, or whatever you want to call it, and they're going to say coincidences are just random. Uh, random.
Well, as you know, I deal with that on a pretty regular basis. And what I'm doing is listening to, again, how you're thinking and how you're suggesting I might think. Uh, and become creative means being open and also curious. letting things come into your mind while your mind is open. And these words need better clarification, but open means let stuff come in. And so I study synchronicity or meaningful coincidence. And I've had this intuition for 2.5 years that if I can use artificial intelligence in a proper way, I can find patterns in coincidence stories that maybe I can't see by looking at the stories myself. And I've had this intuition, this driving thing for quite a long time. And I've been able to try to get other people to help me with it. And something happened, blah, blah, blah. The events don't matter that much, but it begins to appear to be materializing. And how is that? I think it's kind of precognitive because I know there's something to it. And so it's almost teleological, as like meaning I'm drawn towards it. So
Yeah.
what the drawn towards a future being separating from a future that's coming into my mind becomes a fun question to ask you about.
The
Relationship between being drawn to a future
right. Okay.
versus recognizing the future now and predicting it's going to happen.
Well, this is a yeah, this is the big issue here. This is the big question, and this veers into questions of free will and all of the sort of philosophical implications of something like precognition in our lives. And yeah, this was kind of what my first book kind of got obsessed with, which is this question of, how do we think about this sense in which we feel drawn to a future. That was, the reason. Let me go back and give a little backstory here. The reason that Enlightenment science rejected the idea of precognition, what we now call precognition, was that for them, that kind of thing smacked of teleology. That word teleology, which at that time had a very specific meaning. It meant God's plan. It meant God's divine plan. So they couldn't envision something like causes traveling in reverse and so on without imagining that it somehow meant it was God's plan for the universe. And that was very, the rule in science, the new rule in science was you had to take God out of the equation. And it was a very productive rule, that really got us, where we are, in terms of science and technology and so on. I mean, that's where science took off, was really creating these rigid rules about, how to reason and think about natural processes. The rule in science was to get rid of God. So with God, they sort of, with the bathwater, in that bathwater was this idea of teleology, the idea of causes traveling in reverse. Well, we're now, physicists now are realizing, well, we can't do that. What has been called randomness in quantum physics for a century now may really be backward influence from the future of a particle on its present, and that's, if you can scale that up in a quantum computer or in a biological quantum computer like the brain, then you re-enter teleology essentially, but without this sense of purpose or plan. But what replaces that sense of sort of a divine or higher purpose or plan is the way in which we are sort of entrained to an already existing future that's ahead of us in time. And that's that already existing future that we are getting previews of when we have an artistic inspiration or a dream or whatever. Now, the interesting thing, and this is sort of the implication that I've really focused on in my work. I mean, a lot of people talk about precognition, but what interests me most is that when you have an already existing future and the ability to influence the past, for instance, in a waking moment of inspiration, say, you have this, what's called a time loop, because your freely willed actions, say the artist's freely willed actions of creating a sculpture to realize this vision that they've seen, um, inevitably lead to that future that sort of sent that information back in their heads. And that troubles people because they think, wait, so you can't change the future. It invites these ideas of changing the future or changing uh, history, or multiple timelines. People will think of, well, you're seeing possible futures and you're choosing one of them or whatever. I think that's a kind of really incoherent idea. It's fun in science fiction, but it doesn't really work in reality. Um, the reality is you are being influenced by a future, but in this very indirect way that leads you to fulfill that future. And that, I think, I argue, is really a much more interesting and better explanation for why our minds work in symbols and symbolism. And it goes back to Freud. As you know, I'm a big Freud guy. I think he was really kind of on the right track in thinking about the how our minds transform our reality symbolically. He had specific ideas. He thought, well, we do this in order to defend against thoughts that we don't want to have. We're repressing, thoughts, violent thoughts like wanting to kill our father and marry our mother and things like that. I think he was wrong about the reasons our brain transforms things. But he was right about the way they transform things in dreams and in artistic inspirations and so on. We don't have, we can see that we get influenced by the future, but never in a direct way where we can understand why we're seeing this certain event or this certain image, or even that this is about the future. I mean, that very idea, when people have an inspiration, they're not imagining that, oh, this is really some future outcome I'm foreseeing. They just have the impulse to work it out in their art or whatever. And so their freely willed actions then lead them to this realization or this discovery or whatever that has refluxed in their brain and caused them to do this. So there's this time loop in time, this loop in time, this causal loop in time. And it acts like a force. And I think of this a lot in like gravity, because, we think of there being four forces in nature, the electromagnetic force, then there's a couple of nuclear forces, and then there's gravity. But if you talk to a physicist, they'll say, gravity isn't really a force. It's not a force in the same sense that electromagnetism is a force. It's simply the curvature of space into time. It's sort of the shape of space-time that kind of leads things to follow certain paths. Um, and that's kind of the way I think of the space-time of our lives, or our fate, if you will. It's bent by big events, salient events, big rewards, big traumas, and so on. Those big events in our lives kind of shape the paths that we take. And we're not aware of it. We're not, we think we're being freely willed, but in fact, we're following this kind of this gravitational force that leads us to the future that we already did live in our future. We do, our language is unable to grasp these temporal nuances. But I think of it a lot like that. The space-time of the long self is bent, it's curved, and it carries us in these paths. So yeah, we are drawn toward these future outcomes, but it's not in the sense of being pulled like by a force. It's in the sense that the landscape of our lives just kind of leads us naturally along these paths of least resistance towards those futures that we've seen, or we've foresensed in one way or another.
Very good. Very good. What about the idea that precognition is also, I'll say, a probability estimate of what could happen, but not necessarily will happen?
Yeah, I disagree with that view. I think that the precognition is entirely separate kind of uh, capacity from our ability to sort of estimate probabilities and so on. And that ability is much more a product of our conscious, our conscious reasoning. And I often make the distinction between sort of the dreaming brain, which is getting just direct views, even if they're kind of symbolically distorted, they're getting views of actual futures versus like if you're awake at 3 a.m. like I am often, like, mind racing, you know, cycling through, different terrible outcomes and probabilities, and like, that kind of more ruminating, kind of conscious, calculating, you know, trying to assess probabilities of things. That's a very different faculty, and that's the faculty of prediction, and we can predict things. But, the thing that comes through most clearly with any kind of precognitive experience is that these are things you could never predict. They're not things that you could calculate the probabilities of a certain outcome that you have a dream about. That's just not, it always defies that. And this is one of the reasons that the skeptics are so wrong when they try to debunk this stuff. Because often they'll say, well, the thing that you had a dream about, that was likely to happen anyway, or whatever. It's never like that. It's always something incredibly specific and unpredictable, like losing an eye, in a bar fight. I mean, that's not something that uh could have ever been on Victor Browner's bingo card for his future. And that it's that kind of thing that emerges again and again and again in these stories about artists or writers or whatever being influenced by events in their future.
But can also be an art form in the sense of being inspired by something about the future. And I'm asking you pretty seriously to use the example that I'm talking about here with using artificial intelligence bots to look for patterns in coincidence stories, because I think there's a lot of potential in doing that, which includes looking at patterns for our global consciousness, for the collective human consciousness, as reflected by the patterns of meaningful coincidences. And I'm just like, been doing this for 2 years, 2.5 years, thinking about it. And now it's starting to have some action, some traction in the real world, as I found people who are ready and I'm ready. And it feels in my heart, my brain too, but my heart is like, this seems like a right thing to do, and it looks like it has a lot of potential in it. How does what I'm describing fit in with what you're talking about?
Are you referring to your feeling about it, or you're referring to this idea of using AI to?
Both my feeling about the idea of
Yeah.
using AI.
Well, the feeling, you got to go with that. That feeling is that precognitive, current, that you're tapping into. And I think, not only artists, but also people, I've found as I've gotten older, I'm better at like tapping into that intuitive current. It's not what society is telling me to do. It's not what what my what my reason and my left brain is telling me to do. It's kind of what some other little tug. There's a little tug there, and
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
that's
yeah.
and learning to follow that. So that, yeah, that's the precognitive current. So you're doing whatever you need, whatever you're doing, it's right. Now, is your plan going to pay off in the way that you expect and hope? That's where it almost never pays off in the exact way that you think it's going to. It may lead you, to something totally unexpected, that may be the real reward in what you're doing. Uh, that's the nature of art. We cannot know, uh, and the nature of art and the nature of living as a kind of art, is that we cannot know those outcomes. And I'm very much kind of with the ancients, the ancient Greeks, for instance, who had a view of fate that was very ironic. that the more we act intentionally and like, you know, uh, try to produce a certain outcome, the more the universe is gonna like just show that we had hubris. It's gonna it's gonna sort of punish us for our hubris. And stories like, I always go back to the Oedipus story because it was so important to Freud, but it turned out to be really important in his life in a way that he couldn't imagine. And that's, the Oedipus story is really a story about trying to evade a foretold fate, and actually fulfilling that fate exactly by trying to evade it. And I think that, following an artistic path, I mean, I think you have to have that openness, or a scientific path like you're describing, trying to, you feel that it's right to do this thing and you need to do it, but don't expect that the outcome is going to be what you are somehow envisioning.
That's so important, and I know it. And so have the feeling of wanting to do it, and I watch to see what will come in. So a guy contacts me. He doesn't know what he's going to do in his life. He's 40s. In his 40s, he wants to do something different. He's interested in synchronicity. We have lunch and blah, blah, blah. Things happen. And now he's using Chat GPT to do what I had been having in mind to do. And he's doing it with a good foundation from my perspective of what we're trying to have happen. I have ideas about what could happen, but it's the process that's so important. It's it's doing it and see what happens, and not, as you're implying and saying directly, don't have a clear idea like what's what's going to be the outcome. How are we going to monetize this? This is what they all do. And I say, I don't know. I mean, I got some ideas, but I don't know. Let's see what we have here first,
Yeah.
because that's going to be some seeds for what could be happening.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think
Okay,
that's
well,
that's the right
that's
the right
that's not
mindset. I
it's
agree.
okay. It's the right mindset. I just
Yeah.
wanted to maybe and to clarify it because I appreciate being able to talk with you about that. Um, as I think we've gone through some very important ideas here, and I guess oh, I know what I was trying to say is that so I don't have an idea in mind about what it's going to be. I have some possibilities. I'm open to what could be. But if there is an outcome, from your perspective, it sounds like the outcome has already been set. It's already there. I just can't see it.
Right. That's how I think about it. I do think about the future as a landscape, but it's got hills and valleys, and you can't see. It's like you can see a little ways ahead, maybe, but you can't see. Nevertheless, it's influencing you and it's pulling you in a
So
certain way.
that's teleological, and as what I think of it as
Teleological, but you don't need a bearded
no,
god
you don't. No, it's
ring.
the thing
There's
itself
Yeah,
vibrating in the future
right,
like some jewel
right.
that I'm being pulled towards because I'm resonating with that thing itself. There have to be so many instances of people being drawn to a future and then something happens and they don't continue on the path. And how do you know that there was something there when they don't realize, make it real by getting there?
Yeah, but you can imagine that there was something there, and then they did the wrong thing, and they didn't pursue it. But that's in our imagination. I mean, is that really the case? I mean, we don't know.
No,
Uh, and
we
maybe
don't
that
know.
that that failure, or that apparent failure to reach this imagined destination, that's just a construct. That's maybe our construct, and when we're judging them as doing the wrong thing, or maybe that's their own self construct if they're depressed or whatever. But I don't. I'm not a big believer in us getting precognitive information about some reward that we then do not attain. I think that's a mistake. I think we
I
only
I
get precognitive
I
information about things that happen. you know.
I agree with that. And there was some little thing that you said that I'm going to try to reconstruct. Um, is that is that it's it- does the thing exist that I am being drawn to that I can't imagine? I mean, it's important not to know. I mean, as I don't know. Um, does that thing exist somehow, even if I don't get there? Like if I die or something? Like Victor Mansfield, who is Buddhist physicist, synchronicity guy, asked me once, I've got a terminal brain tumor. It's going to kill me. And I have so much to do. And I won't be able to do that. He has the intuition, there's some more to do. So was there something there? It's almost like the smile on the cat, the Cheshire cat. Is the cat there and he just sees the smile? Does it? th- I hope I made clear
Yeah,
with my
I
stumbling.
understand what you're. I understand what you're saying. I mean, the point is our lives are always messy in that way, and our lives always feel incomplete in that way. And that's not necessarily, uh, but I don't think that that's because there was another timeline somehow where we fulfilled those things and we somehow failed. I think that's an inevitable normal feeling of being mortals that, well, we want more time to do all the things that we would like to do, but that doesn't mean that all those plans somehow are actually out there in the universe and, oh, we just failed to grasp them.
Well, let me try to say it a little different in your landscape image, because I love that landscape image because it's a journey. What if there is that something behind that mountain that I have to get to, but there's a lot of places to go. And I don't know what it is, but I'm being drawn to it and it's somehow resonating with me, but I don't get there. And that maybe somebody else will get there.
Someone else might. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's okay. So this is where I sort of veer into in the new book, is where I'm thinking about this in terms of not just the individual long self, but the long self of a culture or a society.
Good, good.
And yeah, I think that's an important dimension to this, because I think precognition, people often ask me about, well, reincarnation and past lives and so on, are we, is our long self extend beyond death, all that. I don't know. I certainly can't say no, but I have not seen strong evidence of precognition of events beyond one's own lifespan. There are claims, of Nostradamus's, foreseeing events past their death, but actually there aren't. I've never seen very strong, claims that really hold up. There are a few counterexamples that I do mention in the book that are perplexing, but they're so few and far between that I'm tempted to say, no, the precognition operates within the individual lifespan, but we are part of a society, we are part of a collective, and we communicate with each other. And I think, particularly in visionary traditions, for instance, initiatory traditions, particularly ones that place a high emphasis on altered states like dreams, or ayahuasca rituals in the Amazon or whatever. When you have a tradition where you have teachers, initiates, and initiators, teachers, students, uh, parents, children, any kind of tradition where information is being passed between the generations, it opens up the possibility of precognitive information from the future traveling into the past beyond the human lifespan, and of getting information from a future beyond our finite, sell by date. If like if as an old man, I teach or initiate a younger person, or hear their dreams or whatever, information from their future, you know may have gotten into their dream, and then I was influenced by what I heard from their dream, and I somehow incorporated that information in my earlier life, in my art or whatever. There's a potential conduit there for information to travel from the more distant future into the more distant past. And I think this is what archetypes are. I think this is another way of looking at what Jung called archetypes. Well, he wasn't the first to use that term. I mean, that's sort of a Platonic and Neoplatonic idea, but that idea of these kinds of core symbols, which he located in the collective unconscious as this thing in the past, this kind of reservoir of information from our phylogenetic past. I think this is exactly how information would be transmitted from a farther future into a more distant past in a society or a culture. Is this kind of archetypal these kind of archetypal forms. So sort of in the new book, I sort of try to reframe or kind of flip Jung uh, and his notion of the collective unconscious, and talk about archetypes as these images and ideas that are transmitting from a farther future via these chains of individuals who are, whose lifespans are kind of staggered in time, and where you have there's that old, you probably remember this old Sam Levinson joke, insanity is hereditary. You can get it from your kids. This was on on bumper stickers back in the 80s, I remember. And, but I think it's not just insanity. I think there are, culture is not just something that's transmitted from the past to the future in terms of enculturation and learning. I think cultural ideas, core cultural ideas, uh, and archetypes can be transmitted in the past, and and this is another way. This creates, or this possibility, what follows from it is another recommendation. So not only should you pay attention to your intuition and that little quiet voice, that little tug, not only should you pay attention to that, you should also pay attention to what younger people are saying, because as as people getting older, uh, we learn from the next generations. We learn from the youngsters in our lives, and that information may be being passed into our past, as intuitions and insights and inspirations and things that we had, years, decades ago. And so, we are part of a channel of information, and we're not aware of it, but we're part of a channel of information traveling from the future into the past. So I think it's very important to nurture these relationships with people of uh, other generations. When you're young, pay attention, respect your elders. Don't just respect them, but listen to your elders. But when you're an elder, listen to and pay attention to young people, because I think that's a transmission cable, I think, of information, archetypal information.
Well, I was in Denmark a couple of weeks ago, and with my host was 36 years old, and she tells her fiance, I can talk with him about all the stuff our group talks about. They were a very, I mean, I'll say spiritual in a broad sense group, and they talked about a lot of weird stuff as if it was real, which it was to me. And they can talk with him about these things, and I have consciously done just that, is try to stay with what younger people are coming up with. I look at it a little differently. They learn from us, so it's faster for them to be able to pick up stuff. But they're also under a lot of pressure now for survival that they hadn't had to have before. So they're figuring out stuff even faster. So I want to listen to them to hear what they have to say because they augment what I understand.
Mhm.
It's a, it's a, I don't know, Eric, that's a great one for the older ones to learn is to listen to, and that Sam Levinson just runs it through. Yeah, it's insanity is genetic. You can get it from your children. It's hereditary. You can get it from your children, and that's what I'm doing. I'm getting the craziness from the kids because the older people rigid is what happens when you get older. It's just a lot of people.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time together, Eric, and this has been like a really fun thing, especially here at the end when we were talking about stuff. But I guess I still have this one more question for you, because the landscape, I'm a kind of a three-dimensional guy because I like sports like football and baseball. I played them a lot, so I'm thinking of like the terrain you're talking about, and this treasure is behind a mountain over there, and I don't get there but my kids can get there or the next generation can get there. That's a simplistic visual, but that's what I got. What do you think of that?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I mean. Yeah.
That's what you
Well,
mean.
yeah. Well, I mean, you got to think of it as a terrain rather than as a playing field. I mean, a playing field is flat, you
Yeah,
know.
a terrain. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
a terrain. I mean, I think of it. I grew up in the foothills of Colorado, and like, I used to every day I would go hiking just among these rock formations and go, in these ravines and gullies and all that. So, it's a landscape. It's a beautiful
it's right.
landscape,
It's right
but
there with you. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you can't see, you can't see what's right around this little hump or this bend. And moreover, you can't go, like, there's all kinds of places you can see, but you can't go there. The terrain takes you along paths, that are accessible to you. And I think that's yeah, so that's how
I,
I.
that's beautiful. I mean, I think it's so important to acknowledge the sources of the patterns of your thinking,
Mhm. Yes.
which you just did. And that's fundamentally important to me. I think meaningful coincidences can show some of that for individuals who collect their stories over time. But I
Yeah,
just
and
as Go
well,
ahead.
on that, I mean, that's what you're coming at it with a different metaphor of team sports, but that's providing another part of the story that my landscape metaphor does not provide, because you're on that field with a lot of other people and you're interacting, and there's this whole social dimension to it.
There
And
is.
and so that's an important, like, the trouble is, no one metaphor can kind of capture the whole thing. But if you could imagine playing a team sport in these like gullies and ravines and in the mountains, I mean, it's like it physically wouldn't quite work. But that human interconnection dimension, you talk about connecting with coincidence, and that's really important. That's really important.
Well, what you've done for me about my flatland story of being on the athletic field is I realized how many hills and gullies there are running with a football trying to get to the goal line.
Sure, it's its own kind of, yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's its own. It's not the same, but I began to see that more. I don't know. I can describe it, but I can't. But I can see the hills and the gullies. But the social and the working together adds another dimension. And coming up with good metaphors is part of the challenge in all this, metaphors that people can operate with. And I think your landscape from the foothills in Colorado to are really a good way of thinking about precognition, uh, the intuitive, creative version of it. So that there's something out there, you feel it, you know it, you're drawn to it. You don't know how you're going to get there, but you just keep doing it because you know something's there calling you.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
beautiful. Well, any last thing you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
No, but I think you've helped me hone in on that that by trying to get me to say, well, how can you do this in your own life? That I don't think I don't even say it in the new book, but that's it, is learning to like listen to that quiet, that quiet little tug, that is so easily drowned out by ordinary demands of life, and unfortunately most people just never validate, or are taught in their lives to ever listen to or validate, because, well, how could this little impulse be important? I have all these other duties that I need to
That's
fulfill.
right.
But
And then I gotta watch YouTube and the sports thing that's coming on, so they're distracted too. That
yeah,
This idea of tuning in to what I'll call intuition, which the tug means is one version of that, is what a lot of us are trying to encourage people to do, because imagination and intuition are getting lost in this digital world that is absorbing all our attention.
Yeah, and
So
so much, and so many, I'm seeing all these videos now of people with these regimens and protocols for improving their lives and in one way or another through fitness and health, all that. But it's just totally, it's providing new rules that, and it's like you got to get out of that rule mindset, that rule following mindset. I think to like listen to this
that's
channel.
really that's really good. I'm glad we got to that. Uh, so thank you very much, Eric Wargo, who is the author of the new book From Nowhere. You can get it on Amazon, From Nowhere. And just to play with the word nowhere, if you look at it and divide it up, it also says now here. So you can get you can get to nowhere, and you can be you can be right here with the same word. So thank you very much, Eric.
Sure, thanks. This has been a pleasure.
This psychosphere is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram of cosmic consciousness.